September 12, 1944. A late summer afternoon in West Texas. The transport truck rattled down a dusty farm road, carrying cargo unlike anything this corner of America had ever seen. Through the canvas covering, 43 German women prisoners peered out at a landscape so vast and empty it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. They had traveled from the East Coast, passing through states whose names they could barely pronounce, heading toward a destination that existed only as coordinates on a military map. Most had never imagined they would see America, let alone as prisoners of war. Lieutenant Catherine Brennan sat in the front passenger seat, reviewing the documents that outlined her unprecedented assignment. The War Department had requisitioned a cattle ranch outside a small town called Cedar Springs for use as a temporary prisoner of war facility. Unlike the massive camps that housed tens of thousands of German soldiers across the American heartland, this operation would be small, housing fewer than 50 women captured during the Allied advance through France. They were members of the Wehrmacht support units, radio operators, administrative clerks, and medical assistants who had served behind German lines. The ranch came into view as the truck crested a small rise. Sprawling pastures stretched in every direction, bordered by split-rail fences that looked nothing like the orderly wire enclosures the women had expected. In the distance, horses grazed beneath cottonwood trees, and a weathered barn stood beside a two-story ranch house. Several men in wide-brimmed hats worked near a corral, their movements unhurried and confident. 22-year-old Anneliese Kohler pressed her face closer to the gap in the canvas. She had grown up in Munich, where buildings crowded together and streets followed medieval patterns laid down centuries ago. This openness unsettled her. There was nowhere to hide here, no walls to provide the illusion of security. Beside her, Frieda Richter clutched a small photograph of her family in Dresden. At 19, she was among the youngest prisoners, and her hands had not stopped trembling since their ship had docked in New York 3 weeks earlier. The truck slowed as it approached the main compound. American soldiers had erected temporary barracks and surrounded them with standard prisoner-of-war fencing, but even this looked oddly out of place against the ranch's rustic character. As the vehicle came to a complete stop, the rear gate dropped open with a metallic clang. Lieutenant Brennan appeared, her expression neither harsh nor sympathetic, simply professional. "Welcome to Cedar Springs," she said in clear English that most of the women could barely understand. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work, you will follow rules, and you will be safe." The women climbed down from the truck, their legs stiff from days of travel. As their feet touched Texas soil, several of the ranch hands paused in their work to watch. The prisoners stood in an uncertain cluster, gray auxiliary uniforms dusty and wrinkled, facing men whose size and bearing seemed to belong to a different species entirely. The first thing Anneliese noticed about the Cowboys was their silence. They did not shout orders or bark commands. They simply watched, thumbs hooked in their belt loops, faces shaded by those impossibly wide hats. One man, tall and broad-shouldered with sun-weathered skin, leaned against the corral fence. He stood at least 6 feet 4 inches, maybe more. Anneliese had never seen men built like this, not even among the supposedly superior specimens of the SS she had encountered in Germany. Lieutenant Brennan led the women toward the barracks, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The temporary structures were simple but clean, wooden frames with canvas roofs, arranged in 2 rows. Inside, metal cots lined the walls, each with a thin mattress, a gray wool blanket, and a small footlocker. It was sparse but no worse than the accommodations many of them had known during their service with the Wehrmacht. "You will have 30 minutes to settle your belongings," Lieutenant Brennan announced through a translator, a nervous young private named Thompson who had studied German at university. "Then you will assemble for orientation and work assignments." As the women dispersed to claim their bunks, whispered conversations filled the barracks. Frieda found a cot near a window and sat down heavily, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Through the opening, she could see the ranch stretching endlessly toward distant hills. A group of horses moved across a far pasture, their bodies catching the late afternoon light. She had ridden once as a child during a summer vacation in Bavaria, but these animals looked different, rangier and wilder than the carefully groomed horses she remembered. Anneliese chose a bunk near Frieda, recognizing that the younger woman needed someone nearby. They had known each other only 6 weeks, having met aboard the prison ship that brought them across the Atlantic. but war and captivity created bonds quickly. In the bunk across from them, Helga Zimmermann, a 31-year-old former nursing assistant from Hamburg, began unpacking her few possessions with methodical precision. Her movements suggested someone who had learned to find control in small rituals. "Did you see the size of them?" Frida whispered in German, her eyes wide. "The men here, they are enormous." "Cowboys," Helga said quietly, having overheard. "I read about them once. They work with cattle, live outdoors. The lifestyle makes them strong." Through the window, the tall man Anneliese had noticed earlier walked past, leading a massive horse by its reins. The animal must have stood 17 hands high, its muscles rippling beneath a coat that shone like polished copper. The man moved with an easy confidence that made the half-ton beast seem docile, as a house cat. He glanced toward the barracks briefly, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat brim, then continued toward the barn. The women watched him go, each absorbed in her own thoughts about this strange new world where even the men seemed built on a different scale than anything they had known. The orientation took place in the ranch's main dining hall, a large room with exposed wooden beams and windows that framed the endless Texas sky. Lieutenant Brennan stood at the front, flanked by 2 guards and Private Thompson who would translate. The 43 women sat on long benches, their posture military straight despite their exhaustion. "You are here because this facility can accommodate your specific needs as female prisoners," Lieutenant Brennan began, waiting for Thompson's translation. "You will work 6 days per week. Your tasks will include laundry, kitchen duties, garden maintenance, and assisting with ranch operations as needed. You will be treated fairly and fed adequately. In return, you will follow all instructions and maintain discipline." As Thompson translated, Anneliese studied the lieutenant's face. There was no cruelty there, but no warmth either. Just the professional detachment of a soldier doing her duty. It was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. What happened next, however, was not predictable at all. The door to the dining hall opened, and 3 men entered. They removed their hats as they stepped inside, revealing sun-bleached hair and faces lined by years of outdoor labor. The tall man from earlier was among them. Up close, his size was even more impressive. His hands, Anneliese noticed, were enormous, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of hard work. "Ladies," Lieutenant Brennan said, "this is Ranch Foreman Jack Hawthorne and his crew, Frank Donnelly and Raymond Cole. They own and operate this property. Some of you will be assigned to work with them." Hawthorne stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. When he spoke, his voice was deep and measured, carrying a drawl the women had never heard before. "Ma'am, if I may?" He looked at Lieutenant Brennan, who nodded. He turned to face the prisoners, his weathered face serious but not unkind. "I know you can't understand much of what I'm saying," he began, waiting for Thompson to catch up with the translation, "but I want you to know something. This here's a working ranch. We got cattle to move, horses to care for, fences to mend. It's hard work, honest work. I don't care where you're from or what uniform you wore. Long as you're here, you'll be treated with respect, and I expect the same in return," Thompson translated, stumbling slightly over the colloquialisms. The women sat in stunned silence. They had expected harsh treatment, perhaps even cruelty. They had been prepared for contempt and anger from their captors. But this man, this giant of a man who could probably break any of them in half without effort, was speaking to them about respect. Frida leaned toward Anneliese and whispered, "He is nothing like what we were told Americans would be." Anneliese nodded slowly, watching as Hawthorne placed his hat back on his head and touched the brim in what seemed to be a gesture of farewell. Nothing about this place matched what she had been taught to expect. The first work assignments began the following morning at dawn. Anneliese found herself part of a group of 8 women assigned to assist with ranch operations. They stood near the main barn, uncertain and nervous, as the September sun climbed over the eastern hills. The air smelled of hay and leather, scents that were foreign yet somehow not unpleasant. Frank Donnelly, a wiry man in his 40s with kind eyes and premature gray in his hair, approached them with Private Thompson trailing behind. "Morning," he said simply, then waited for the translation. "We're going to start you ladies off easy. Feeding the horses, cleaning stalls, basic work, nothing complicated." He led them into the barn, a cavernous structure that seemed to swallow the light. Horses occupied stalls on both sides, their heads appearing over the half doors as the group passed. Annalise had expected the animals to be frightening up close, but instead found herself drawn to their quiet presence. One mare, a gray with a white blaze down her face, stretched her neck toward them with obvious curiosity. "That's Silver," Donnelly said, his voice gentle. "She's a sweetheart. Wouldn't hurt a fly." He demonstrated how to measure out grain and hay, his movements efficient but unhurried. The women watched closely, trying to absorb information despite the language barrier. Helga, the former nursing assistant, stepped forward first. She had always been practical, someone who dealt with fear by taking action. Donnelly handed her a bucket of grain, mimed what she should do. She approached Silver's stall cautiously, poured the feed into the trough. The mare nickered softly, a sound that made several of the women smile despite themselves. "See?" Donnelly said, grinning. "Easy as pie." Thompson translated the phrase literally, causing confusion. Annalise frowned. "Easy as pie? What does this mean?" Thompson tried to explain, but Donnelly just laughed, a warm sound that echoed in the barn. He made a gesture with his hands, simple and clear. "Easy, not difficult." The women nodded, understanding spreading across their faces. Over the next hour, they worked in pairs, feeding horses and filling water buckets. The physical labor felt good after weeks of confinement during transport. More importantly, the horses asked nothing of them except basic care. There was no judgment in those large, dark eyes, no questions about nationality or politics. Just the simple exchange of work for survival that had existed between humans and animals for thousands of years. Raymond Cole appeared in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning light. He was younger than the others, perhaps 30, with a quiet intensity about him. "Frank, we need help moving the herd to the south pasture," he called. Donnelly nodded, then looked at the women. "Some of you want to see real cowboy work?" He made a sweeping gesture toward the door, toward the open range beyond. Several women exchanged glances, then Annalise raised her hand. Adventure had always called to her, even here, even now. The cattle drive, even this short one, revealed a world the German women had only seen in American films before the war. Hawthorne and his crew worked with a synchronicity born of years together, guiding nearly 200 head of cattle across the open range with whistles, calls, and subtle shifts of their horses' positions. The women watched from a safe distance near the fence line, transfixed by the choreography of it all. Annalise noticed how the men seemed to communicate without words. A slight nod from Hawthorne would send Cole circling left. A low whistle from Donnelly would bring a straying cow back into line. Their horses responded to the smallest pressure of knee or heel, as if rider and animal shared a single mind. It was unlike anything in her experience of military precision. This was something older, more intuitive. By midday, the cattle were settled in their new pasture, and the men rode back toward the barn. Sweat darkened their shirts, and dust coated their faces, but they seemed content, even happy. Hawthorne dismounted near where the women stood, his movements fluid despite his size. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and drank deeply, then offered it to Annalise without thinking. She froze, uncertain. Was this allowed? Was it a test? Behind her, the other women held their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Hawthorne seemed to notice her hesitation. He shook the canteen gently, a slight smile creasing his weathered face. "It's just water, ma'am," he said softly. "Won't hurt you none." Thompson wasn't there to translate, but the meaning was clear enough. Annalise reached out, took the canteen, drank. The water was warm but clean, tasting faintly of metal. She handed it back with a small nod of thanks. Hawthorne touched his hat brim in acknowledgement, then passed the canteen to Frida, who stood beside Annalise. That evening, Lieutenant Brennan made an announcement that surprised everyone. The ranch had always provided meals for its workers, and the kitchen facilities were adequate to feed the additional mouths. Rather than maintaining separate dining arrangements, prisoners and American personnel would eat together in the main hall. There would be assigned seating and strict protocols, but the decision had been made that efficiency outweighed the complications of segregation. The first shared meal was awkward. The women sat at tables on one side of the hall, American soldiers and ranch hands on the other. Conversations were muted, self-conscious, but the food was substantial, more generous than many of the prisoners had eaten in months. There was beef stew, thick with vegetables, and fresh bread still warm from the oven. Coffee flowed freely, strong and bitter in the American style. Hawthorne sat with his crew, speaking in low tones. Once, his eyes met Annalise's across the room. He didn't look away with hostility or discomfort. He simply nodded, the same small gesture of acknowledgement he'd given her that afternoon. In that moment, something began to shift in her understanding of this place and these people. October brought cooler nights and the first mail delivery since the women's arrival. Lieutenant Brennan distributed the letters in the barracks, calling out names from a clipboard while the prisoners waited in tense silence. Some received multiple envelopes, others none at all. The letters had been censored, black ink obscuring anything deemed sensitive, but they were connections to a world that seemed increasingly distant. Frida received 2 letters, both from her mother in Dresden. She retreated to her bunk and opened them with trembling hands. The first was dated July, written before Frida's capture. Her mother's handwriting was shaky but legible, describing the increasing frequency of air raids and the growing scarcity of basic supplies. The second letter, from August, was shorter, more desperate. Her father had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, the people's militia formed from old men and boys. Her younger brother, only 16, had also been called up. Annalise watched Frida's face crumble as she read. Tears fell onto the thin paper, smudging the already faded ink. Around the barracks, similar scenes unfolded. Some women wept openly, others sat stone-faced, absorbing news of destroyed homes, missing relatives, cities reduced to rubble. The war they had left behind was entering its final, most desperate phase, and their families were bearing the cost. Helga received no letters at all. Hamburg had been devastated by firestorms 2 years earlier, and she had not heard from her family since before her capture. She sat on her bunk, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. The absence of mail was its own kind of message, one she could not bring herself to interpret. That evening during dinner, the atmosphere in the hall was notably subdued. The German women picked at their food, lost in thoughts of home. Even the American soldiers seemed to sense the change, their usual banter muted. Hawthorne noticed immediately. He was a man who paid attention to the rhythms of his surroundings, whether in animals or people. After the meal, as the women filed back toward their barracks, he approached Lieutenant Brennan. Their conversation was brief, conducted in low tones near the kitchen entrance. Annalise, lingering behind her group, caught fragments of it. "They got bad news from home," Hawthorne was saying. "You can see it on their faces." "They're prisoners of war, Mr. Hawthorne," Brennan replied, though her voice lacked its usual crispness. "This is war. Everyone's receiving bad news." "Yes, ma'am. But they're also people who are a long way from home and can't do a thing to help their families. That's a particular kind of hell." Brennan was silent for a moment. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing that breaks regulations," Hawthorne said. "Just maybe a little extra patience over the next few days, little more understanding." Annalise hurried to catch up with her group before she was noticed, but Hawthorne's words stayed with her. He had called them people, not prisoners, not enemies, just people. It was such a small thing, yet it mattered more than she could have explained. The grief that followed the mail delivery lingered for days, but gradually the routine of work began to provide a kind of solace. There was something healing in physical labor, in tasks that had clear beginnings and endings, problems that could actually be solved. Annalise found herself drawn more deeply into the ranch work, volunteering for assignments that kept her outdoors and active. One cool October morning, Donnelly approached her with a coiled rope in his hands. "You interested in learning something new?" he asked through Thompson's translation. Behind him, several horses stood tied to the corral fence, waiting to be exercised. Annalise nodded, curious despite her uncertainty. Donnelly held up the rope, a lariat made of stiff braided hemp. "This here's the most important tool a cowboy owns, after his horse," he explained. "You can move cattle with it, catch a runaway, mend a fence, even save a life if you know what you're doing." He demonstrated the basic loop, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy. The rope seemed to come alive in his grip, forming perfect circles in the air. "Now you try," he said, handing it to Annalise. The rope felt awkward and heavy in her hands. When she tried to replicate Donnelly's movements, it tangled immediately, collapsing into a confused heap at her feet. Frida, who had joined them, giggled despite herself. It was the first time Annalise had heard her laugh since the letters arrived. Donnelly just smiled patiently. "Takes practice," he said. "Took me years to get it right, and I grew up doing this." He showed her again, slower this time, breaking down each movement into components she could understand. The rotation of the wrist, the timing of the release, the way you had to feel the rope's weight and use it rather than fight against it. For the next hour, Annalise practiced while Donnelly worked nearby, occasionally offering corrections or encouragement. Other women gathered to watch, some asking to try themselves. Donnelly produced more ropes, and soon half a dozen German prisoners were attempting to master the basic lasso, their concentration absolute. Cole rode up on his horse, a massive bay gelding, and paused to watch the scene. "You're gonna make cowgirls out of them," he called to Donnelly, amusement evident in his voice. "Might do worse," Donnelly replied. "They're harder workers than most of the ranch hands we've hired over the years." It was a casual comment, but Annalise caught it. A compliment, offered without fanfare or expectation. She felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to pride. Not the rigid, nationalistic pride she had been taught to feel in her service to the Reich, but something simpler and more personal. The satisfaction of learning a new skill, of being recognized for honest effort. Her next throw came closer to forming a proper loop. Donnelly noticed and nodded his approval. "There you go," he said. "You're getting it." November arrived with shorter days and temperatures that dropped sharply once the sun disappeared behind the western hills. The work continued, but the pace shifted slightly, accommodating the changing season. One evening, Annalise and several other women were finishing their tasks near the main barn when Hawthorne emerged carrying an armload of firewood. "Getting cold," he said, more to himself than anyone else. He glanced at the women, then made a decision. "You ladies finished for the day?" Thompson had already left for the evening, so Hawthorne spoke slowly, using gestures to supplement his words. "Come on, we got coffee by the fire." He led them to a clearing behind the barn where a large fire pit had been built from river stones. Several logs served as benches around the perimeter. Donnelly and Cole were already there, warming their hands near the flames. A battered coffee pot sat on a metal grate over the fire, steam rising from its spout. The women hesitated at the edge of the clearing. This felt different from the structured meals in the dining hall or the supervised work assignments. This was social, informal, almost friendly. Annalise looked back toward the barracks, where Lieutenant Brennan could probably see them from her office window, but the lieutenant made no move to intervene. Hawthorne poured coffee into tin cups and handed them out, his movements easy and unhurried. "Sit if you want," he said, gesturing to the logs. "Or stand. Either way's fine." Slowly, the women sat. The fire's warmth was wonderful after a day spent outdoors, and the coffee, though bitter, heated them from the inside. For several minutes, no one spoke. They simply existed together in the gathering twilight, watching sparks rise toward the darkening sky. Cole broke the silence, speaking to Hawthorne about plans for the following day's work. Their conversation was casual, punctuated by long pauses that didn't seem awkward or uncomfortable. Annalise realized this was how these men always were, comfortable with silence, speaking only when necessary. It was so different from the constant noise of military life, the endless orders and responses. Frida, emboldened by the informal atmosphere, pointed to the sunset and said one of the few English phrases she had learned. "Very beautiful." Hawthorne followed her, gazed to where the sky had turned deep orange and purple above the hills. "Yes, ma'am," he agreed. "Never gets old, no matter how many times you see it." He paused, then added, "One of the reasons I could never leave this place. This land gets in your blood." Donnelly translated haltingly into his limited German, and the women nodded in understanding. Annalise thought of Munich, of narrow streets and gray stone buildings, of church bells and crowded plazas. Beautiful in its own way, but nothing like this vast openness where the sky seemed infinite and the land stretched beyond imagination. They sat together until full darkness fell, enemies by definition but something else in practice, something without a name, at least not yet. December brought news that changed everything. Lieutenant Brennan called an assembly in the dining hall, her face more serious than usual. The women gathered, sensing something significant in the air. American soldiers lined the walls, their expressions carefully neutral. Brennan stood at the front, a stack of newspapers and photographs on the table beside her. "I'm going to show you something," she began, waiting for Thompson to translate. "This isn't easy, but you need to see it. You need to know the truth about what your country did." The first photographs showed liberation of concentration camps. Brennan passed them slowly through the group, allowing each woman time to absorb what she was seeing. Skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors who looked more dead than alive, their eyes hollow and haunted, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoriums still filled with ash and bone. The women's reactions varied. Some turned away immediately, refusing to look. Others stared with growing horror, hands over their mouths. Frida began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face. Helga sat frozen, her nursing training making her unable to look away even as every instinct screamed at her to do so. "These are from Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz," Brennan continued, her voice steady but hard. "Allied forces discovered them as we advanced. Millions murdered. Men, women, children. This is what you served, whether you knew it or not." Anneliese felt her world tilting. She had known about prison camps for political enemies, certainly. Everyone knew that. But this systematic, industrial scale of death? She thought of her service, how proud she had been to contribute to Germany's defense, how certain she had been of her country's righteousness. Now these images were stripping away every certainty she had ever possessed. "We didn't know," someone whispered in German. "We didn't know." "Many Germans didn't," Brennan acknowledged, her tone softening slightly. "But not knowing doesn't erase what happened. You're going to have to decide what you do with this knowledge, how you move forward." That night, the barracks were silent except for muffled weeping. Some women lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Others wrote letters home, though what could one possibly say? How could you ask your family if they knew? How could you bear either answer? Anneliese sat on her bunk, her hands shaking. She thought about the officers she had worked for, the reports she had typed, the communications she had transmitted. Had any of her work contributed to this horror, even indirectly? The questions were unbearable, but she forced herself to confront them. Through the window, she could see the ranch house in the distance. A light burned in one window where Hawthorne often worked late on his account books. She wondered what he thought of them now. Whether kindness extended to people who had served a regime capable of such evil, even unknowingly. Whether redemption was possible when the sins were this vast and terrible. She had no answers, only questions that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The days following the revelation were the darkest the camp had known. The women moved through their work mechanically, hollow-eyed and silent. Conversations ceased almost entirely. Meals went largely uneaten. Even Lieutenant Brennan seemed affected by the pervasive despair, her usual efficiency tempered with something that looked like sympathy. The cowboys noticed immediately. Men who spent their lives reading the subtle signals of animals were equally attuned to human distress. But their response was characteristically understated. They didn't offer speeches or platitudes, they simply showed up, steady and present, continuing to treat the women exactly as they had before. 3 days after the assembly, Hawthorne found Anneliese sitting alone near the corral fence during her lunch break, her food untouched beside her. He approached quietly, leaning against the fence several feet away, respecting her space but making his presence known. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stood there watching the horses graze in the distance. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "My grandfather fought in the First War," he said. "Came back different. Took him years to talk about what he'd seen." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He told me once that the hardest thing wasn't what he'd done or seen himself. It was learning what his own side had done when he wasn't looking. Things that made him question everything he'd believed about who the good men were." Anneliese understood enough English now to follow most of it. She looked at him, surprised that he was sharing something so personal. "I'm not saying it's the same," Hawthorne continued. "What you learned, what your country did, that's its own kind of terrible. But I've watched you work these past months, watched you treat the animals with kindness, Help the younger girls when they're struggling. Do every task we've given you with honesty and effort." He turned to face her directly. "What matters now is what you do going forward. Not where you came from or what flag you served under." He pushed off from the fence, preparing to leave. "Actions," he said simply. "That's how you show who you really are. Not words, actions." Over the following weeks, the Cowboys maintained their steady presence. Donnelly continued teaching rope work, never mentioning the assembly or the photographs. Cole included the women in discussions about horse care, treating them as legitimate students rather than prisoners who needed surveillance. When Frida struggled with particularly heavy buckets, Hawthorne quietly replaced them with lighter ones, without comment or ceremony. They didn't demand gratitude or transformation. They didn't lecture about redemption or forgiveness. They simply continued to offer the same quiet respect they had from the beginning, demonstrating through their actions that people could be more than their worst moments, that the future didn't have to be determined by the past. It was a kind of grace the women had never experienced, offered not through words but through the thousand small gestures of daily life. Winter settled over the ranch with unusual intensity. January brought freezing temperatures and ice storms that coated everything in crystalline beauty and treacherous danger. The work became harder, more urgent. Cattle needed constant monitoring to prevent frostbite and starvation. Water troughs froze overnight and had to be broken each morning. Fences required repairs where ice had brought down branches and posts. The German women worked alongside the Americans and Cowboys with increasing competence. Months of labor had hardened their bodies and taught them skills they never imagined possessing. Annalise could now throw a lasso with reasonable accuracy, mend a fence line, and calm a nervous horse with voice and touch. Frida had learned to drive the ranch truck, navigating the rutted roads with confidence that would have seemed impossible 4 months earlier. But it was during a crisis that the true integration became evident. A January blizzard struck without warning one afternoon, catching several cattle in an exposed pasture. Hawthorne immediately organized a rescue operation, calling for every available hand. Lieutenant Brennan hesitated only a moment before releasing the German women to help, recognizing that principles mattered less than survival in situations like this. They rode out in teams, wrapped in whatever warm clothing could be found, following Hawthorne and his crew into the blinding white chaos. The wind screamed across the open range, driving snow horizontally with enough force to sting exposed skin. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The cold was brutal, sharp enough to freeze breath in lungs. Annalise rode beside Cole, clinging to her saddle as her horse struggled through deepening drifts. She had never been more terrified or more alive. When they finally found the cattle, huddled together against a ravine wall, the real work began. They had to guide the animals back toward shelter, fighting wind and cold, and the cattle's own panic. Helga's horse stumbled in a hidden ditch, throwing her into a snowbank. Before the American soldiers could react, Frida was there, helping her up, checking for injuries with the efficiency of someone who understood that speed mattered in this cold. They got Helga back on her horse and continued moving. It took 3 hours to drive the cattle to safety. By the time they reached the barn, everyone was frostbitten and exhausted, but all the animals had survived. In the barn's relative warmth, they worked together to dry off the cattle, check for injuries, distribute hay and warm water. Nationality had ceased to matter. There was only the shared purpose of preserving life against a hostile environment. Hawthorne moved among them, checking each person with the same care he'd given the animals. When he reached Annalise, he placed a heavy hand on her shoulder briefly. "Good work out there," he said simply. "Couldn't have done it without you." It was the first time he had spoken to her as an equal, as a fellow ranch hand rather than a prisoner under his temporary supervision. The distinction mattered more than she could articulate. She had proven herself not through words or promises, but through action under pressure. February brought the first whispers that the war in Europe was nearing its end. Radio broadcasts spoke of Allied advances deep into Germany, of cities falling, of resistance collapsing. In the barracks at night, the women listened to whatever news filtered through, trying to imagine what their homeland looked like now. The Germany they had left no longer existed, and the one emerging from the ashes was impossible to envision. Lieutenant Brennan received updated instructions from the War Department regarding the eventual repatriation of prisoners. Processing would begin soon after Germany's surrender. The women would be returned home, given basic provisions, and released to rebuild their lives as best they could. It was presented as a certainty, the natural conclusion to their captivity. But something unexpected was happening at the ranch. The lines between prisoner and worker had blurred over the winter months. The women ate meals alongside the cowboys, worked the same jobs, shared the same hardships. Some had formed genuine friendships with the American soldiers assigned to guard them. Annalise found herself dreading the thought of leaving, though she couldn't bring herself to examine why too closely. One evening after dinner, Hawthorne found her alone in the barn, checking on a mare who was due to foal soon. The animal was restless, uncomfortable, pacing her stall. Annalise spoke to her softly in German, her hand gentle on the horse's neck. "She trusts you," Hawthorne observed, leaning against the stall door. "Animals know when someone means them well." "I will miss her," Annalise said, her English much improved now, "when I go back to Germany." Hawthorne was quiet for a moment. "You thinking about what comes next?" "Always," she admitted. "My city is destroyed. My family, I do not know if they live. Everything I knew is gone." She paused, struggling with vocabulary and emotion. "But here, I learn things. I learn I am not what I thought I was, that I can be different." "What if you didn't go back?" Hawthorne asked quietly. "At least not right away." Annalise looked at him sharply. "This is possible?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know there's going to be a need for workers once the war ends. People who know how to work hard, who've proven themselves trustworthy. The War Department might allow some prisoners to stay if they had sponsors, places to work, people willing to vouch for them. The possibility hung in the air between them, fragile and frightening. To stay in America would mean choosing exile, abandoning any hope of reuniting with family, embracing a country that had been her enemy. But Germany held only ruins and painful memories, a past she could never reclaim and wasn't certain she wanted to. "I would need to think," she said finally. "Talk to the others." "Of course," Hawthorne said. "Just wanted you to know it might be an option, for those who want it." He touched his hat brim in farewell and left her alone with the restless mare and her impossible choices. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The news reached Cedar Springs in the early afternoon. Church bells rang in the nearby town, and the sound carried across the prairie on the spring wind. In cities across America, crowds filled the streets in celebration. At the ranch, the reaction was more subdued, but no less significant. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally over in Europe. Lieutenant Brennan gathered everyone in the dining hall. American soldiers, ranch hands, and German prisoners stood together, unified by the moment's gravity, even as it meant vastly different things to each group. Brennan's voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of emotion. "Germany has surrendered. Unconditionally," she announced, waiting for Thompson's translation. "The war in Europe is over. For you." She addressed the German women directly. "This means your status will change. You will no longer be prisoners of war. Processing for repatriation will begin within the month. You will be going home." The words should have brought relief, even joy. Instead, they landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of confusion and uncertainty through the assembled women. Going home. But what did home mean now? Letters from Germany painted pictures of devastation so complete it seemed biblical. Cities reduced to rubble, millions dead or displaced, famine and disease spreading through the ruins. The Germany they had known was gone, replaced by something unrecognizable and desperate. That evening, the traditional victory celebration dinner felt awkward and strange. The American soldiers were jubilant, relieved that the fighting in Europe had finally ended. The Cowboys were more reserved, mindful of the complicated emotions swirling around them. The German women sat quietly, picking at their food, lost in private calculations about impossible futures. After dinner, Annalise found Hawthorne near the barn. The spring evening was mild, and fireflies had begun their nightly dance across the pastures. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say, but the words still came haltingly. "You spoke of possibility," she began. "To stay. Is this still true?" Hawthorne nodded slowly. "I've been talking with Lieutenant Brennan and some folks in town. There's precedent for it. Prisoners who want to stay and have sponsors willing to vouch for them. It ain't easy. Lots of paperwork and approvals needed. But it's possible. If I ask this, Annalise said carefully, would you be sponsor for me? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither fully acknowledged. Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the fading light. Yes, he said, finally. I'd be honored to. You've proven yourself 10 times over. This ranch, this life, you've taken to it in a way most people never do. I think you belong here, if you want to stay. Annalise felt tears threatening but held them back. I want to stay, she whispered. I choose to stay. And with those words, she committed herself to a future she could barely imagine, in a country that had been her enemy, beside people who had somehow become her home. The decision split the women almost evenly. 21 chose to request permission to remain in America. 22 elected to return to Germany. The choice revealed no pattern of age or background, no clear predictor of who would stay and who would leave. It came down to something more fundamental, more personal. Each woman had to weigh her own particular constellation of losses and hopes. Frida chose to go home, despite everything, despite the devastation she knew awaited her. She could not abandon the possibility that her family had survived. My mother needs me, she explained to Annalise one evening as they packed her few belongings. If she is alive, she will be looking for me. I cannot let her search forever. Helga, who had received no word from Hamburg in over a year, chose to stay. There is nothing for me there, she said quietly. Only ghosts. Here, I can help people, use my nursing skills to build something instead of mourning what cannot be recovered. The process of securing permission for those who wished to remain was complex and time-consuming. Lieutenant Brennan worked tirelessly, filing paperwork, making telephone calls, arguing with bureaucrats who saw only regulations and precedents. Hawthorne and other ranchers from the area submitted sponsorship papers, promising employment and vouching for the women's character. Local church groups offered housing assistance. Slowly, impossibly, approvals began to come through. The day of departure arrived in late June. A convoy of trucks would take those returning to Germany to a processing center in New York, then to ships bound for Europe. The morning was clear and warm, wildflowers blooming across the prairie in waves of purple and gold. The women gathered outside the barracks, divided now into 2 groups that would travel different paths. The farewells were wrenching. Women who had survived capture, imprisonment, and transformation together now had to let go. Frida and Annalise held each other for a long moment, both crying openly. They had sustained each other through the darkest times, and now circumstances were pulling them apart. Write to me, Frida said in German. Tell me about this new life you are building. I will, Annalise promised. And you tell me about Germany, about rebuilding. We will stay connected. Similar scenes unfolded across the compound. Promises were made, addresses exchanged, tears shed. Even some of the American soldiers found themselves moved. These men who had guarded women they were supposed to consider enemies, now saying goodbye to people they had come to respect. Hawthorne stood apart, watching quietly. When Annalise caught his eye, he nodded slightly, a gesture of support and understanding. She was staying, but the cost of that choice was written on her face as she watched her friends climb into the trucks. The convoy pulled away slowly, raising dust that glowed golden in the morning light. Those remaining watched until the trucks disappeared over the horizon, carrying away pieces of their shared history toward an uncertain future. Then they turned back toward the ranch, toward the life they had chosen, toward the hard work of becoming something new. The transition from prisoner to immigrant was gradual and sometimes painful. The women who remained faced practical challenges that their captivity had shielded them from. They needed to learn English fluently, understand American customs, navigate a society that still viewed Germans with suspicion and sometimes outright hostility. The small town of Cedar Springs had mixed reactions to their presence. Some residents welcomed them cautiously, impressed by their work ethic and willingness to integrate. Others remained hostile, unable to separate these individuals from the regime they had served. Annalise continued working at the ranch, now as a paid employee rather than a prisoner. Hawthorne kept his word, providing fair wages and decent housing in a small cottage on the property. She learned to manage accounts, order supplies, and eventually took over much of the ranch's administrative work. Her fluency in both German and English made her valuable as more European immigrants began arriving in the area, displaced persons seeking new starts in America. Helga completed her nursing certification through a program at the county hospital. The head physician, Dr. Morrison, had initially been skeptical, but her skill and dedication won him over. Within 2 years, she became head nurse of the emergency ward, known for her calm competence during crises and her particular gentleness with children. The other women found their own paths. Some married American soldiers or local men, creating families that embodied reconciliation between former enemies. Others pursued education, opened businesses, or simply worked hard at ordinary jobs, building unremarkable but honest lives. They formed a tight community, gathering monthly to share meals and maintain connections to their shared experience. Letters arrived regularly from Germany, from the women who had returned and were navigating their own difficult transitions. Frida wrote of finding her mother alive but struggling, of her brother who had not returned from the war, of the overwhelming task of rebuilding from literal rubble. Her letters were heartrending but also contained moments of hope, small victories in the face of catastrophic loss. The correspondence flowed both ways. Annalise wrote about spring roundups and autumn harvests, about learning to bake apple pie and understanding baseball, about the strange beauty of becoming American while remaining forever German in some essential part of herself. She described the ranch's expansion, how Hawthorne had purchased adjacent land and she was helping manage the larger operation. She did not mention how his steady presence had become the foundation of her new life, how his quiet strength had taught her different ways of being strong. Years passed. The sharp edges of their prisoner of war experience softened into memory, though it never disappeared entirely. They carried it with them always, this knowledge of how far people could fall and how far they could climb back. On the ranch, Annalise would sometimes pause in her work to watch the sun set over the hills, painting the sky in colors that still took her breath away. She had chosen this place, this life, and despite everything it had cost her, she had never regretted that choice. She had found something here she had not even known to look for, a home earned through action rather than accident of birth. 25 years after Victory in Europe Day, Annalise Kohler Hawthorne stood before a gathering at the Cedar Springs Community Center. She had been invited to speak about reconciliation and the possibility of transformation, part of a series commemorating the war's anniversary. Now, an American citizen with grown children who knew more about cattle ranching than they did about Munich, she carried with her a worn leather diary, the same one she had clutched when she first arrived at the ranch. The audience was mixed, young and old, Americans and newer immigrants from various countries. Some were there out of genuine interest, others from curiosity about the woman who had been an enemy prisoner and become one of the town's most respected citizens. She spoke in English now, with only the faintest trace of an accent, though she still dreamed in German some nights. "People ask me why I stayed," she began, her voice steady. "They want to know what made me choose exile over returning home. The truth is more complicated than any single answer can capture. I stayed because I had seen what my country had done, and I could not reconcile that horror with remaining there. I stayed because I had discovered in American captivity something I wanted to spend my life defending, the possibility of redemption through honest work and honest living." She spoke of those early days, the fear and uncertainty, the unexpected kindness from men like Hawthorne, Donnelly, and Cole, who had treated them as human beings worthy of respect, rather than enemies to be punished. She described the transformation that had occurred, not through force or propaganda, but through the simple accumulation of daily interactions that revealed shared humanity. "The cowboys who worked this ranch taught us something profound," she continued. "They showed us that strength is not about domination or ideology, it is about consistency, reliability, showing up day after day to do what needs doing." They were, in their way, much larger than our own men, not just in physical size, but in their capacity for grace. In the audience, Hawthorne sat beside their 2 children, his weathered face attentive. They had married 3 years after the war ended, a quiet ceremony that scandalized some and inspired others. Their partnership had become legendary in the county, a model of what could be built when people chose to look forward rather than back. Annalise concluded by reading from her old diary, Entries written during those transformative months, the questions she had asked herself then, the doubts and hopes, the slow dawning realization that she could choose to become someone different than who she had been. "We cannot change where we came from," she said, closing the diary gently. "But we can choose where we go from here. That choice, renewed every day through our actions, is the only freedom that truly matters." The story of the German women who chose to stay had become more than personal history. It had become a testament to America's capacity for offering second chances and to the human ability to transcend even the deepest divisions. Their choice had been vindicated not through words but through the lives they had built, the families they had raised, the communities they had served. They had become living proof that redemption was possible, that home could be chosen rather than inherited, and that even from the ashes of the worst that humanity could do, something new and good could grow.